Have you ever endured prolonged harassment from a neighbor? Imagine waking up every morning, stepping outside and finding your mailbox vandalized. At first it seems like a random nuisance, but as time goes on, the incidents become more malicious, impossible to ignore. What would you do? Could you remain patient or would you take action? This is the story of Christopher Martinez, a man who found himself facing relentless hatred and destruction at the hands of his neighbor, Charlotte King. She wasn't just trying to damage his property, she was playing a never-ending game of psychological warfare. What finally pushed him to take a stand? And how did everything change forever? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on how to deal with harassing neighbors. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more eye-opening and inspiring stories. Christopher Martinez never imagined that something as small as a mailbox could turn his life upside down. One morning, with a hot cup of coffee in hand, he stepped outside to check his mail, just like any other day. But what he saw left him frozen in shock. His mailbox was pried open, its hinges barely holding together. Letters were scattered across his yard, some soaked from the morning dew. At first, he brushed it off as an accident, maybe strong winds or some kids playing too rough. But as he bent down to pick up the damp letters, a strange sense of unease settled in. A few days later, it happened again. This time, the mailbox was bent at an odd angle, as if someone had deliberately tried to destroy it. Christopher's frustration began to build, but he convinced himself it was just harmless neighborhood mischief. He repaired the mailbox and carried on, but the incidents didn't stop. Each time, the damage worsened. Then one morning, he walked outside and saw his mailbox completely torn apart. The entire post was leaning sideways, as if someone had ripped it from the ground with brute force. Christopher couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. But who would do this? And why? These questions haunted him as he realized that something much darker was at play. His patience was running out, and he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. What he was about to do next would change everything. Christopher Martinez felt his frustration boil over as he looked at his destroyed mailbox once again. But this time, he didn't just stand there helplessly like before. He started paying attention to the little details, the subtle signs he had previously ignored. The strange looks from the house next door, the odd, almost mocking remarks from Charlotte King, a longtime resident who had never really spoken to him. She always kept her distance, but her words had a passive-aggressive bite to them, like she was watching something unfold, something she found amusing. One night, as Christopher sat in his living room, a sudden metallic clanking noise sent a jolt through him. The sound was eerily familiar. He didn't need to think twice. It was the unmistakable thud of a baseball bat hitting his mailbox. He grabbed his phone and quickly opened the security camera app. When the screen lit up, his heart nearly stopped. There she was, Charlotte, standing under the streetlight, gripping a baseball bat. With each swing, she struck the mailbox with brutal force. She didn't hesitate, didn't waver, just relentless, calculated destruction. And in minutes, his mailbox was nothing more than a pile of twisted metal and splintered wood. Christopher couldn't believe his eyes. The neighbor he had barely interacted with was the one behind it all. A surge of shock, mixed with anger, flooded his mind. She had been doing this the entire time. But the bigger question remained. Why? Why was she targeting him? And what could he do to stop her before things escalated even further? Christopher Martinez felt a surge of anger and frustration filling his chest as he finally confirmed that Charlotte King was the one behind the destruction of his mailbox. But instead of acting recklessly, he knew he had to handle this smartly. His fury forced him to pause, reminding himself that he needed solid proof, not just vague suspicions. On a quiet night, as the streetlights dimmed and the world drifted into sleep, Christopher decided to install a small security camera on his front porch. Positioned at just the right angle, it would capture every movement around his mailbox. He told no one about his plan. He didn't want to escalate the situation. But deep down, he knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about uncovering the truth, and the truth would set everything straight. A few days later, standing before his phone screen, he watched as the slow-motion footage played out like a nightmare. Charlotte, with her baseball bat, appeared once again, a shadow in the night. But this time, she didn't just smash the mailbox. She stopped. She stared directly into the camera, as if daring him to react. A wave of shock and unease rushed over him. This wasn't just vandalism. Charlotte was provoking him, testing his patience, pushing him to respond. At that moment, Christopher was no longer just a victim. He had the evidence in his hands, and now everything was about to change. But one question lingered in his mind. Would Charlotte finally stop, or was this just the beginning of something far more dangerous? Christopher couldn't tear his eyes away from the newly recorded footage. A chilling realization crept over him as the undeniable truth unfolded on his phone screen. Under the dim glow of the streetlight, Charlotte King stood with a baseball bat gripped tightly in her hands. Without hesitation, she swung once then again, relentless, merciless. His mailbox crumpled under the force of her strikes. Through the speakers, he could hear the sharp screech of metal bending and breaking. His heart clenched. A mix of emotions surged inside him: anger, disbelief, and an unexpected pang of sorrow. Charlotte, the woman he had assumed would never intentionally harm anyone, was the one systematically tearing apart his life. Did she even realize that her actions wouldn't just affect him, but would have consequences for everyone around her? Yet amidst his frustration, another emotion took root: hope. He had the proof. No more guessing. No more unanswered questions. This wasn't just mindless destruction, it was a deliberate challenge, and he wasn't going to let it continue. The truth was out. Now everything was in his hands, but one question still haunted him. Did Charlotte understand that she couldn't hide from the truth forever? Christopher Martinez sat in silence, his heart pounding, but he knew an impulsive reaction wouldn't solve anything. The footage from his security camera left no room for doubt. Charlotte King, the neighbor he once thought of as ordinary, was the one who had been destroying his mailbox all along. But now wasn't the time for rash decisions. If he wanted her to face the consequences, he needed undeniable proof, evidence that no one could dismiss. The tension weighed on him as he waited. Every night he struggled to sleep, listening intently for any movement outside, wondering if tonight would be the night she struck again. Part of him wished she would stop, but deep down he knew better. Charlotte wasn't stopping, and neither was he. Then one night, the familiar sound echoed through the air, the sharp crack of metal being struck. She was back. This time, she didn't just take a swing. She hit the mailbox repeatedly, almost as if testing his patience, daring him to act. Christopher didn't rush. He simply watched, recording everything, collecting the final pieces of evidence he needed. With every passing second, his frustration gave way to something calmer: resolution. Soon, Charlotte wouldn't be able to deny the truth any longer. But the question that wouldn't leave his mind was this: did she really believe she could keep pushing him into a corner forever? And did she realize that, in the end, the truth would always win? Christopher Martinez's eyes locked onto the metal objects around him. The solid steel, unyielding, much like his newfound determination. He was exhausted from Charlotte King's relentless vandalism, from the chaos she had injected into his life. Once he had believed they could coexist peacefully as neighbors, but now his patience had run dry. He refused to let her win. A sense of regret welled up inside him. Moving into this neighborhood, all he had wanted was a peaceful life, free from senseless conflicts. But now he had no choice but to change everything. Each blow to his mailbox had heightened his frustration, and his pulse quickened as he made his decision. He would install a steel mailbox, not just to protect his property, but to reclaim his dignity. He would no longer allow Charlotte to disrespect him. As the hardware store worker handed him the thick steel mailbox, Christopher felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. This would be the end of the constant destruction. But he also knew this was only the beginning. Would Charlotte continue her attacks, or would she finally realize that things had changed? The question lingered in his mind, but one thing was certain: this time nothing would break him. With renewed resolve, he returned home, ready to put his plan into action. Everything was set for the next step. Christopher Martinez sat in the dark, the glow of his phone screen casting shadows across his face. Anxiety and anticipation churned inside him. The footage from his security camera played, and this time he saw exactly what he had been waiting for. Charlotte King, The neighbor who had tormented him for months emerged once again. She gripped a baseball bat tightly, her stance tense, her intent unmistakable. With full force, she swung at the newly installed steel mailbox. A loud metallic clang echoed through the night, but the mailbox didn't budge. Christopher's eyes stayed fixed on the screen, yet a part of him felt an odd sense of pity. Charlotte had no idea that this time everything was different. The mailbox was no longer an easy target. He couldn't help but feel a sliver of sympathy for her, a person so consumed by anger and desperation that she resorted to brute force to solve her problems. But as her strikes continued to fail, Christopher felt something else rising inside him. Satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Each failed swing of Charlotte's bat was a silent defeat, a direct response to her arrogance. Christopher wondered, did she understand now that she couldn't control everything forever? Did she realize that her actions weren't just making things worse for him, but were pushing her closer to self-destruction? The question swirled in his mind, but the answer was clear. This battle had never been about strength. It was about patience and intelligence. And finally, he was ready to move forward. Christopher Martinez stood in the darkness, his eyes locked on his phone screen, his heartbeat racing as the security footage played. This time, he knew something was about to change. Charlotte King, the woman who had tormented him for months, stepped into view under the dim glow of the streetlight, her baseball bat clenched tightly in her hands. She had no idea the steel mailbox was different. She swung. The moment the bat struck the metal, a mild electric shock pulsed through her hands. She staggered, her grip loosening as she recoiled in surprise. Christopher watched in silence, a mix of emotions swelling inside him. Relief, satisfaction, but also an odd sense of regret. The shock wasn't strong enough to hurt her, but it was enough to make her stop, to make her realize that this time, things weren't going her way. Tension still gripped his chest, but deep down, he knew. This was the moment Charlotte would be forced to face reality. She hadn't expected this. This wasn't a battle of force. It was a battle of patience and intelligence, and Christopher had finally reached the turning point. Charlotte stumbled back, her face flashing between confusion and anger. But the moment Christopher saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a new thought crossed his mind. Did she finally understand that this wasn't a game anymore? Would she keep pushing the limits? Or would she stop before things spiraled beyond her control? The answer would come soon, and Christopher was ready to bring it all to an end. Each frame from the security camera cut through the truth like a blade, exposing the actions of Charlotte King. The neighbor Christopher once thought was just an ordinary person. Every swing of her baseball bat against his steel mailbox had been captured in sharp detail. Each time Charlotte struck, she remained unaware that every movement was being recorded, that every action would be dragged into the light, beyond her ability to escape. But now, as Christopher watched Charlotte realize she had been caught, he saw something shift within her. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with panic, her face twisted in confusion. She turned, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. No shadows could conceal what she had done. Christopher felt something indescribable: regret, a trace of sympathy, and a sense of relief. Did Charlotte understand now that the truth always finds a way, no matter how hard one tries to deny it? A pressing question lingered in his mind. Would she face the consequences of her actions, or would she continue living in denial? Christopher knew he had won, but the price of this truth, perhaps, would be greater than he had anticipated. Christopher Martinez stood behind his window, watching as a police car pulled up in front of Charlotte King's house. The entire neighborhood seemed to sense that something was happening, the tension thick in the air. As the officers stepped out and approached Charlotte's home, a wave of relief washed over Christopher, though it was tinged with something else: regret. At last, Charlotte would have to face the consequences of her actions. But this didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. A part of him still felt a twinge of sorrow at seeing a neighbor he had once thought to be harmless, now answering to the law. Charlotte stood at her door, her face stiff, unreadable as she looked at the officers. She lifted a hand, a small, unconscious gesture that seemed caught between confusion and defense. One of the officers gestured toward Christopher's mailbox, And for the first time, Charlotte's face twisted in visible distress. Her expression cracked like thin ice, revealing the fear beneath. She could feel the weight of what was happening to her, yet there was no escaping it now. In that moment, Christopher couldn't help but wonder, did she truly regret what she had done? Or did she only feel trapped, forced into this moment with no way out? A strange realization dawned on him. No matter how much damage she had caused in the end, the truth had won. Could Charlotte face the reality of what she had done, now that it had been fully exposed? The answer would come soon, and Christopher was ready to see it through. Since the truth had come to light, Charlotte King had become the unavoidable topic of conversation throughout the neighborhood. Every time she stepped outside, murmurs followed her, hushed voices carrying fragments of gossip. The weight of judgment hung over her like a storm cloud. Christopher Martinez couldn't help but feel a tinge of sympathy, even though she had been the one to disrupt his life. Now she faced complete isolation, not just the scrutiny of the law, but also the coldness of the community that had once accepted her. It was a painful sight. Charlotte had destroyed more than just property. She had shattered any connection she had with the people around her. From a distance, Christopher observed her loneliness. A part of him regretted seeing a person unravel like this, watching someone who had once been a part of the neighborhood now stand as an outcast. Did she understand what she had done, not just to him, but to herself? The stares from the other neighbors were like silent barriers, pushing her further into the role of an outsider. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Yet something stirred inside Christopher. Would she learn from this? Would she eventually find redemption? Or would she forever be trapped in the shame and alienation she had brought upon herself? The question lingered, but one thing was undeniable. Charlotte's life had changed forever, and in the end, the truth had won. Charlotte King stood in the middle of the crowd, her panicked eyes darting around. The people she once considered friends now looked at her with cold indifference, their gazes distant and unwelcoming. Every step she took along the sidewalk felt watched, scrutinized. No one wanted to talk to her anymore. Her past actions, her vandalism and destruction, had become an unerasable stain in the minds of the community. From a distance, Christopher Martinez observed in silence, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and empathy. He had witnessed her actions firsthand, but now he saw something else. Her isolation, the weight of regret pressing down on her. She could no longer act as she had before. Everything had changed. The respect she once held had been replaced by disdain and avoidance. Christopher couldn't help but feel a sense of sorrow. She had done this to herself, yet he could also recognize the pain of someone facing the irreversible consequences of their actions. The biggest question lingered in his mind. Would Charlotte learn from this, or would she continue to drown in shame, never finding a way back to herself? In that moment, Christopher realized that sometimes punishment doesn't come in the form of legal consequences. It's the solitude one is forced to endure after losing everything. The day Charlotte King decided to sell her house and leave, the neighborhood felt unusually quiet, her front door shut with an eerie stillness. No goodbyes, no final glances. Christopher Martinez stood by his window, watching the moving truck pull away. There was no anger left in him, no lingering resentment. Instead, there was relief, a deep sense of peace he hadn't realized he had been craving for so long. Her presence had made his life stressful, exhausting, and filled with tension. And now, with her departure, things seemed to settle back into place, yet a faint feeling of regret lingered. Charlotte had disrupted his peace, but she had also been a part of the neighborhood story. Would she ever realize how her own decisions had led her to this point? Would she ever find a place to call home again? Or would she carry her shame with her wherever she went? As much as her leaving symbolized a fresh start, Christopher couldn't shake one final question. Was life truly better without her, or was this just an escape from an unfixable situation? Still, in the quiet of that evening, he felt a strange sense of connection to himself, a reassurance that he had reclaimed the peace he had always deserved. Christopher Martinez stood at his window, watching Charlotte King's door close for the last time. All the tension, all the frustration she had brought into his life, it was gone. But as her moving truck disappeared around the corner, something unexpected surfaced inside him. Relief, and yet an odd twinge of regret. The months of hostility, the battle between them, had turned his life upside down. Yet now looking back, he realized that Charlotte's own actions, her own choices, had led her to this moment. She had to pay the price. What he had learned wasn't just that hatred can destroy everything, but that one must never let it cloud their judgment. In that moment, Christopher didn't just feel satisfaction. He felt hope. Hope that, after all the chaos, life would finally return to peace. Hope that he had learned something valuable about himself and the way he handled adversity. He understood now that the worst thing a person can do is let hatred control them, because in the end, it only leads to isolation and regret. This story doesn't just end with Charlotte's departure. It serves as a powerful lesson about the consequences of our actions. It highlights the way hatred can consume and isolate us, and how every choice, no matter how small, leaves a mark that eventually comes back full circle. Yet it also shows the power of patience and resilience. Christopher didn't let anger drive his decisions. He chose to handle things smartly, strategically, letting the truth speak for itself. Forgiveness isn't just about kindness. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. And perhaps the biggest lesson of all, no matter what others do to us, we are the ones who decide how we move forward. Learn from the past, but never let it define your future.